Today, I want to talk about something incredibly powerful, something that both science and personal experience confirm again and again. It's the idea that if you give yourself just 6 months with focused effort, consistent behavior, and the right neurological tools, you can quite literally change the trajectory of your life. This isn't hyperbole. This isn't vague optimism. It's based on how your brain and body are wired for adaptation. The human nervous system is not fixed. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change itself, is active throughout life. What that means is, no matter your starting point, no matter what habits you've struggled with in the past, your biology supports change. But there's a catch: it requires deliberate intensity and repetition over time. We now know from neuroscience research that behavioral change hinges on systems like dopamine, focus, and deliberate discomfort. The first few weeks will challenge your identity, but that discomfort is a signal, not a problem. It tells you that your brain is beginning to prune away the old and reinforce the new. So today, I'm not just inviting you to believe in transformation. I'm inviting you to understand how real biological transformation works and to engage with it like an experiment for 6 months. 6 months of structured intensity. 6 months of showing up. 6 months of becoming your own protocol. Neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to change itself in response to experience. This is not just a scientific curiosity, it is the foundation of how any transformation happens, whether physical, emotional, or behavioral. When we talk about giving yourself 6 months to change everything, what we are really talking about is giving the brain 6 months of consistent, repeated experience to rewire itself. Every thought you have, every action you take, and every behavior you engage in sends a signal to your nervous system, telling it what to strengthen and what to discard. The challenge most people face is not that change is impossible, but that they never stay with the same signal long enough for the nervous system to adapt. Neuroplasticity is time-dependent and repetition-dependent. Sporadic effort will not lead to meaningful rewiring, but daily, structured repetition, especially when paired with focus and emotional engagement, can completely reshape how the brain processes information, how the body responds to stimuli, and how habits are formed and maintained. The first principle of engaging neuroplasticity is intensity. The brain does not change in response to neutral, passive engagement. It changes in response to challenge and focus. When you deliberately practice a new behavior, whether it's waking up early, changing your nutrition, exercising, meditating, or writing, you need to bring full attention to the activity. Passive repetition is far less effective than deep, attentive repetition. This is because the brain's plasticity mechanisms, such as long-term potentiation, rely heavily on the release of certain neuromodulators like acetylcholine and norepinephrine, which are only released when we are fully engaged. This is why multitasking and distraction are enemies of change. If you spend 6 months half engaged with your goals, you will only get halfway results. But if you direct high-intensity focus towards specific actions every day, even for short bursts, you activate the very circuitry that drives change at the cellular level. Another key element is timing. Neuroplasticity is heightened during certain windows. For instance, the first 30 minutes after waking is a prime time for learning and encoding new behaviors because your brain is naturally more plastic due to shifts in brain chemistry. Leveraging this window to practice your key habit, whether it's movement, writing, goal setting, or learning, can accelerate the rate at which your nervous system encodes that behavior as part of your identity. Similarly, repetition spaced across the day, ideally morning and evening, strengthens the signal. The brain does not care how you feel about the activity, it cares how often you do it. Repetition is the driver of identity. What's often misunderstood about neuroplasticity is that it's not just about learning new skills. It's about unlearning old patterns. Every time you engage in a new behavior, you are not only building new connections, you are weakening old ones through a process called synaptic pruning. This is why consistency is so important, because every day you repeat the new behavior, you reinforce it while simultaneously degrading the neural pathways of the old behavior. The challenge is that the old habits were likely formed through repetition over many years, so the brain will resist initially. This resistance is not a sign to quit. It's a sign that your brain is undergoing structural change. Discomfort and internal resistance are biological indicators of growth. In the 6-month journey of change, there will be a constant interplay between your conscious willpower and your subconscious programming. Willpower gets you started, but it's the automaticity of neural circuits that sustains behavior. Your job is to repeat the new habit until it becomes the default setting. Studies show that the average time it takes to form a stable habit is not 21 days, it's closer to 60 to 120 days, depending on the complexity and emotional salience of the behavior. This is why the 6-month time frame is so powerful. It gives the brain more than enough time to convert effortful action into effortless identity. But that conversion hinges entirely on repetition. You must show up even when motivation fades, especially when motivation fades. Habits become hardwired when they are practiced under slightly varying conditions. If you only perform the habit in perfect circumstances, your brain won't generalize the neural encoding. But if you train yourself to repeat the habit even when you're tired, stressed, or distracted, the neural circuitry becomes resilient. You're not just teaching the brain what to do, you're teaching it to do it under pressure. And this is why elite performers train under stress. It builds mental flexibility. You can use the same principle in your own transformation. Repeat the habit every day, and especially on the hard days. These moments have a disproportionately powerful effect on neuroplasticity because the brain encodes effort paired with adversity as high-priority information. There is also a role for visualization in enhancing repetition. The brain cannot fully distinguish between real and vividly imagined behavior. Mental rehearsal activates many of the same neural pathways as physical action. When you mentally practice your desired behavior, seeing yourself do it, feeling the emotions tied to it, imagining overcoming obstacles, you are reinforcing the same circuitry. This means that even on days when you can't perform the habit physically, you can still build the mental architecture for it. Visualization, when done with emotional intensity and sensory detail, becomes a form of neuroplastic training. It should not replace real action, but it can supplement it powerfully. Dopamine is one of the most misunderstood yet powerful drivers of human behavior. Most people think of it as a reward chemical, something the brain releases when we achieve success or experience pleasure, but that's only half the story. The real power of dopamine lies in how it fuels motivation, effort, and pursuit. It's not the reward itself that spikes dopamine, it's the anticipation, the striving, the challenge. This is critical to understand if you want to transform your life in 6 months. Because if you learn to control when and how dopamine is released in your brain, you can begin to shift from being someone who waits for motivation to someone who generates it internally. You no longer have to rely on external rewards, praise, or outcomes to drive action. You become your own source of fuel. When dopamine is released in response to progress, effort, and challenge, it reinforces those behaviors and makes you want to repeat them. This is called reward prediction error. The brain creates a model of what it expects, and when the experience either exceeds or aligns with the prediction, dopamine reinforces the pathways that led to it. What's fascinating is that you can deliberately train your brain to release dopamine from the process itself rather than from the outcome. This is called rewarding the effort, and it's one of the most valuable psychological shifts you can make. If you say to yourself, "I'm proud of myself for showing up today," or "this moment of discipline feels good," you are literally teaching your brain to link pleasure to action instead of result. Over time, this changes how you approach goals. You stop chasing distant achievements and start enjoying the pursuit itself. The modern world is saturated with dopamine triggers, social media likes, junk food, notifications, entertainment, all designed to hijack your dopamine system and provide quick hits with no effort. This is a problem because it trains your brain to associate dopamine with passive consumption instead of active creation. If you constantly indulge in these artificial spikes, your baseline level of dopamine starts to drop. You need more stimulation to feel normal. Motivation fades, focus erodes, energy declines. The way to reverse this is to reset your dopamine system by reducing artificial stimuli and deliberately earning your dopamine through hard work, consistency, and progress. This doesn't mean cutting out all pleasure, but it does mean being intentional about what you allow to trigger reward in your brain. There's a concept in neuroscience called the dopamine schedule. This refers to how often and in what pattern dopamine is released based on your behaviors. If you reward yourself randomly and intermittently, such as celebrating small wins that aren't always predictable, you actually increase your motivation more than if rewards come at fixed intervals. This is the same principle that makes slot machines addictive, but you can use it constructively. For example, occasionally surprise yourself with a reward after a tough workout or a deep work session, but don't make it a routine. Keep the brain guessing and it will keep producing dopamine in anticipation. When applied to self-development, this strategy builds resilience, enthusiasm, and drive over longer periods. Another tool for managing dopamine is deliberate discomfort. Studies show that dopamine levels increase not only after a reward, but also during the experience of challenge if that challenge is framed positively. Cold exposure, fasting, strenuous exercise, focused learning, all of these can be made more rewarding if you mentally associate them with growth and identity building. If you interpret the challenge as meaningful, your brain will release more dopamine during the activity, not just after it. This flips the traditional pain-pleasure model. You start to crave the hard things because they begin to feel internally rewarding. This is not just mindset, it's neurochemistry in action. The story you tell yourself about effort literally changes the chemical response your brain has to that effort. You also want to avoid what is called dopamine stacking. This happens when you combine multiple sources of dopamine, like scrolling your phone while eating, or listening to music while working out while also thinking about rewards. The more you stack, the more you desensitize your receptors. The brain becomes overloaded and the individual activity loses its intrinsic appeal. To maintain sensitivity, try to isolate your sources of pleasure. Let exercise be about movement, not entertainment. Let eating be about nourishment, not distraction. Let learning be about discovery, not multitasking. The more clean your dopamine hits are, the more potent and sustainable they become, and the more you'll be able to keep going without burning out. The final component is to create a baseline of satisfaction that doesn't rely on novelty. Novelty is a huge trigger for dopamine, but it's not sustainable. If you need everything to be new and exciting all the time, you'll eventually crash. But if you can find meaning in repetition, if you can train your mind to associate effort, structure, and progress with internal satisfaction, you'll be able to keep going long after most people quit. This is what separates those who transform their lives from those who start and stop. They have learned to work with their brain's natural chemistry instead of being ruled by it. One of the most overlooked elements of lasting transformation is the environment in which we operate every day. The brain is a prediction machine, constantly scanning the external world for cues that help it determine what to do next. Every object, sound, light source, device, or person in your environment sends a signal to your nervous system. These signals either support your goals or compete with them. When you leave your environment to chance, you're essentially letting external randomness control your focus and behavior. But when you deliberately design your environment to reduce decision fatigue and support your desired identity, you create conditions for sustainable change. Decision fatigue refers to the gradual erosion of willpower and mental clarity as a result of making too many choices. It's not just big decisions that wear down your brain, it's the small, repeated, seemingly harmless ones. What to eat, when to start work, whether to scroll or not, whether to go to the gym. When your brain has to constantly weigh options, compare alternatives, and resist distractions, it starts to burn through cognitive resources. Over time, your ability to make disciplined choices declines, even if your motivation remains strong. This is why highly disciplined people don't rely on willpower alone. They automate as many decisions as possible by designing their environment to make the desired action the path of least resistance. The first step is to reduce the number of choices you face in your high-performance windows. For example, if your goal is to wake up early and begin your day with purpose, set your phone across the room the night before, turn off all unnecessary notifications, lay out your clothes, and decide what your first task will be. This eliminates the need for mental negotiation in the morning. Your brain doesn't need to decide whether to hit snooze, what to wear, or what to do first. It simply executes. By front-loading decisions when your energy is high, typically the night before, you protect your future self from impulsive behavior. Digital environments also play a massive role. If your phone is filled with apps that trigger distractions or tempt you into low-value behavior, you are fighting a battle every time you pick it up. You can redesign this environment by uninstalling apps, using grayscale mode, turning off badges, or placing your most essential tools front and center. When your devices are aligned with your priorities, they stop being a source of noise and start becoming an extension of your goals. This is not about restriction, it's about alignment. You are designing your digital tools to serve your mind rather than scatter it. Physical spaces matter just as much. The layout of your workspace, bedroom, kitchen, or training area influences your behavior more than you might think. If your workspace is cluttered with distractions or things that don't serve your purpose, your brain will expend energy resisting temptation. But if you enter a space that is clean, intentional, and primed for focus, your nervous system enters a different state. Light, posture, sound, and even temperature all modulate your brain's state of arousal and readiness. For example, bright overhead light and upright posture activate alertness, promoting circuits in the brainstem and cortex. This makes you more focused and less prone to procrastination. Subtle environmental changes can have massive cumulative impact over a 6-month period. You can also stack your environment with behavioral cues that trigger your desired habits. This is known as cue-based habit formation. If your goal is to journal each morning, placing your journal and pen on your pillow or next to your coffee mug creates a frictionless pathway to follow. If your goal is to exercise, placing your shoes and water bottle by the door the night before reduces the psychological barrier to starting. These small cues serve as neural primers. They signal to the brain what to do next, reducing the cognitive cost of initiation. Once a behavior is initiated, it becomes easier to sustain. The key is to reduce the energy required to begin. Another strategy is to deliberately limit access to temptations or behaviors that you are trying to change. This is known as environment shielding. If you're trying to reduce mindless eating, remove processed snacks from your line of sight. If you're trying to focus more deeply, install website blockers during your deep work hours. These small boundaries protect your attention and energy. The brain is highly responsive to what is available and visible. Out of sight often truly becomes out of mind because neural circuits tied to reward seeking are not activated in the absence of triggers. It's important to understand that your environment is not neutral. It's always nudging you towards something. Either it's supporting your discipline or it's making discipline more difficult. By redesigning your physical, digital, and social environments to be congruent with your goals, you create a form of external structure that supports internal consistency. This doesn't mean you have to live rigidly or remove all flexibility. It means the default choices in your environment are aligned with the identity you are trying to build. The fewer decisions you have to make in the moment, the more energy you have to stay consistent with what matters most. Stress is often perceived as a negative force, something to avoid or eliminate, but this is a misunderstanding of how the human body and brain are designed to function. From a biological and evolutionary standpoint, stress is a catalyst for adaptation. It is the signal that alerts your nervous system to the need for change. When managed and directed correctly, stress can become one of the most powerful tools in the process of transformation. The key is not to avoid stress, but to learn how to engage with it deliberately, using it to drive mental, emotional, and physical growth over time. This approach is grounded in the concept of hormesis, where exposure to controlled amounts of stress strengthens the system. The human nervous system is designed to respond to challenge. When you experience stress, your body releases hormones like adrenaline, cortisol, and noradrenaline. These hormones increase alertness, focus, and energy availability. In short bursts, this stress response sharpens your cognitive and physical abilities. If you avoid all discomfort or always seek comfort, your nervous system becomes less responsive and more fragile. But if you train your brain and body to step into stress on purpose, to deliberately engage in effortful, uncomfortable activities, you teach your system to become more resilient. This is how athletes, performers, and high achievers in any field build endurance, both mentally and physically. They don't just endure stress. They rehearse it, they learn to breathe through it, and they eventually thrive within it. There are two types of stress, eustress and distress. Eustress is the kind of stress that feels challenging but manageable. It's the signal that you're pushing your limits in a healthy way. Distress is the type of stress that overwhelms the system, often caused by chronic, unrelenting pressure without recovery. The goal is to intentionally engage in eustress-producing activities, cold exposure, focused learning, hard workouts, public speaking, fasting, writing, or problem solving, so that your nervous system becomes more adaptive. Each time you enter a controlled stress state and then return to baseline, you increase your capacity for future challenge. Your heart rate recovers faster, your breathing normalizes more quickly, and your mind regains clarity sooner. This cycle of challenge and recovery is how resilience is built. The reason this matters for a 6-month transformation is because growth cannot occur in the absence of stress. Change is inherently uncomfortable. The moment you attempt to adopt a new habit, wake up earlier, move your body more, eat differently, or think in a new way, you're introducing stress into your system. If you perceive that stress is a threat, your nervous system will resist it. But if you interpret that stress as a signal of growth, your brain releases chemicals that support learning, memory, and motivation. Perception of stress determines its impact. This is supported by research showing that people who believe stress helps them grow actually have better health and performance outcomes than those who see stress as purely harmful. Another important factor is your breathing and posture during stress. These are direct inputs to the autonomic nervous system. When you are under pressure, your breath becomes shallow and rapid, and your posture often collapses. But if you train yourself to slow your breathing, to take deliberate inhales and even longer exhales, you send a signal to your brainstem that you are in control. This activates the parasympathetic nervous system and allows you to maintain clarity even under pressure. Likewise, an upright posture with expanded chest and lifted head changes the body's interpretation of the moment. These physical adjustments can shift your internal chemistry from panic to readiness, allowing you to use stress as fuel instead of letting it become a barrier. Sleep and recovery are also essential components of stress adaptation. When you challenge your system during the day through intense effort, learning, or physical strain, your body and brain need rest in order to rebuild. Sleep is when the brain consolidates memories, repairs neural tissue, and restores chemical balance. Without adequate recovery, the stress you accumulate turns from beneficial to harmful. But with strategic cycles of stress and rest, you accelerate adaptation. This is why rest is not laziness, it's part of the protocol. The nervous system can only grow stronger if it has the chance to reset. Pushing constantly without breaks leads to burnout, but cycling between deliberate intensity and intentional rest leads to expansion. Equally important is developing the mindset that difficult moments are invitations for rewiring. When you encounter friction, when a workout feels hard, when a conversation is uncomfortable, when the temptation to quit is loud, those are the exact moments when your identity is reshaping. The brain is most plastic under emotional weight. If you can stay present in those moments, breathe, and take one more step, you're literally building new neural pathways. You're proving to your brain that you can operate under pressure. You're building trust in yourself. Over time, what used to feel overwhelming becomes familiar. What once triggered avoidance now signals opportunity. This is how stress becomes not an enemy but a compass. One of the most critical shifts in achieving deep, lasting transformation is moving from identity-based excuses to identity-based discipline. Most people approach change by trying to manipulate their behaviors, wake up earlier, exercise more, procrastinate less, but they do so while still holding on to a self-image that contradicts those actions. The brain, however, will always work to stay consistent with the identity it believes is true. If you see yourself as someone who just isn't consistent, or always gives up, or can't focus, you will subconsciously create conditions to prove that narrative right. This is not a character flaw, it's a neurological loop. Identity shapes perception, perception shapes behavior, and behavior reinforces identity. To truly change your life in 6 months, you must be willing to challenge and reconstruct the internal blueprint of who you think you are. Every behavior you repeat is a vote for the type of person you believe yourself to be. If you skip a workout, that's not just a missed session, it's a reinforcement of the story that you are someone who avoids discomfort. If you sit down to write even when you don't feel like it, that action strengthens the belief that you are disciplined. This works both ways. Habits are not just routines, they are identity statements. The more you align your daily decisions with the version of yourself you want to become, the faster the transformation happens. It's not about faking it. It's about behaving as if the new identity is already real and allowing the brain to rewire itself through consistency. Neuroscience supports this. The prefrontal cortex is responsible for planning, decision-making, and self-control. When you set a goal or visualize a future version of yourself, that region activates. But if the rest of your brain, particularly the limbic system, doesn't believe the identity change is real, it will create emotional friction. You'll feel inner resistance, imposter syndrome, or doubt. The solution is not to eliminate doubt, but to create more evidence. Identity is shaped by experience. The more you act like the person you want to be, even in small, deliberate ways, the more coherent your internal system becomes. The brain starts to believe the change is possible because it has data. Start with micro commitments. These are small, daily actions that are so achievable you can't fail. 1 push-up, 1 page of reading, 1 5-minute cold shower, 1 10-minute deep work sprint. The goal isn't the action itself, it's the vote of confidence it casts toward your new identity. You begin to associate yourself with action, with progress, with discipline. These micro-commitments build momentum, and momentum is what keeps neurochemical motivation active. Dopamine is released not when the goal is achieved, but when progress is felt. Each small win compounds. The system begins to shift from I'm trying to be disciplined to I am disciplined. That linguistic shift may seem subtle, but neurologically it's massive. You can also use visual cues to reinforce identity. This isn't about empty affirmations, but about wiring your environment to reflect who you are becoming. A wall calendar filled with unbroken streaks, a whiteboard with your new non-negotiables, a journal with your daily discipline metrics. The human brain responds to patterns. When your surroundings reflect progress, you begin to embody it more fully. You stop needing motivation because your identity starts driving behavior automatically. You are no longer performing discipline, you are living it. Another powerful technique is to use identity scripting. This involves writing or speaking in the voice of your future self. Not as wishful thinking, but as programming. You might write, I'm the kind of person who finishes what I start, or I train every day because it aligns with who I am, or I'm at peace in discomfort because growth is my priority. These scripts can be read each morning as part of your routine. The repetition builds familiarity, and what is familiar to the brain becomes comfortable. Over time, these scripts stop feeling aspirational and start feeling factual. There is also a chemical and physiological basis for why identity-based change works. When your actions align with your internal values and self-image, the brain releases serotonin, which regulates mood, focus, and social connection. Feel congruent, integrated, and stable. But when there's a gap between who you want to be and how you're behaving, the brain registers internal conflict, often releasing stress hormones like cortisol. This internal dissonance doesn't just feel uncomfortable, it reduces cognitive flexibility and drains motivation. That's why identity congruence isn't just psychological, it's biochemical. The more your actions match your self-image, the more efficient your brain becomes. The most profound transformations happen when your identity becomes non-negotiable. You no longer have to negotiate with yourself every day about whether to train, whether to show up, whether to choose discomfort over ease. It simply becomes who you are. The decision has already been made at the identity level, so execution becomes effortless. This frees up mental energy and reduces internal resistance. You start to operate on principle rather than on impulse. You build a self-image that is solid enough to carry you through the inevitable valleys of doubt and fatigue. The final and often most underestimated factor in sustainable transformation is your ability to maintain emotional control in real time. The nervous system is wired to react before it reflects. When you're tired, triggered, frustrated, or disappointed, the default response is emotional reactivity. But emotional reactivity is the enemy of consistency. It creates detours. It pulls you out of focus. It hijacks your time, your decisions, and your attention. To stay on track over 6 months of disciplined effort, you must train yourself to observe your emotional responses without being governed by them. This is not emotional suppression, it is emotional mastery, a skill that can be developed just like physical strength or mental clarity. Every emotion has a physiological signature. Anger increases heart rate and narrows visual focus. Anxiety disrupts breathing and creates mental loop patterns. Sadness lowers energy and reduces motivation. These responses are not random, they are part of your autonomic system's attempt to prepare you for perceived threats or needs. But in a world that constantly bombards your system with stimulation notifications, opinions, comparisons, deadlines, these emotional circuits are often misfiring. You might feel threat where there is simply challenge. You might respond to pressure with avoidance instead of presence. The path to change requires not just behavior shifts, but regulation of the systems that influence those behaviors. One of the most effective tools for emotional regulation is breath control. Breathing is the only function that is both automatic and voluntary, meaning it gives you direct access to your state. When you feel overwhelmed, extending your exhale longer than your inhale activates the parasympathetic nervous system, signaling to your brain that you are safe. This downregulates cortisol and noradrenaline, calming your physiology. It creates a window where your thinking brain can come back online. This is crucial because you make your worst decisions when you're in a sympathetic dominant state. You send a text you regret, you skip a workout, you break your streak, not because you're weak, but because your body is operating from fight or flight circuitry. Learning to pause and control your state allows you to choose your next action instead of being dictated by emotion. Another layer of emotional control is learning to identify and name your internal experience. Neuroscientific research has shown that simply labeling an emotion, this is frustration, this is doubt, this is resistance, reduces its intensity. The prefrontal cortex activates, allowing the brain to observe rather than fuse with the feeling. This is a form of self-distancing that gives you leverage over your internal state. It transforms the emotion from something you are into something you are experiencing. That space between stimulus and response is where discipline is born. And the more often you practice this in the moment during a tough workout, a boring task, or an uncomfortable conversation, the more your brain learns that you are in control, not your emotions. Mental reframing is also essential. Emotional responses are largely interpretations. Two people can experience the same situation with radically different reactions based on the narrative running through their mind. If you miss a day of progress and tell yourself, "I'm failing," that emotion leads to guilt and discouragement. If instead you tell yourself, "This is part of recalibrating," your nervous system stays regulated. You're more likely to get back on track quickly. The brain believes the story you tell it. Emotional control is not just about suppression, but narration, choosing the lens through which you interpret events. This shifts the chemistry of your experience and keeps you in momentum. There is also a social component to emotional regulation. The people around you can either trigger dysregulation or support coherence. Conversations filled with drama, pessimism, or comparison flood your brain with unnecessary emotional noise. On the other hand, environments that encourage composure, clarity, and long-term thinking strengthen your ability to stay calm and deliberate. This is why choosing your influences is not just about avoiding negativity, but about protecting your nervous system. Every interaction either stabilizes or destabilizes your state. High performers understand this and are deliberate about who they let into their emotional space. Boundaries are not a luxury, they are a neurological necessity. Sleep, nutrition, and movement are also emotional regulators. When you're sleep deprived, your amygdala, the brain's fear and emotion center, becomes hyperactive. Your ability to manage frustration or delay gratification plummets. A clean diet that supports stable blood sugar and gut health reduces the physiological triggers of mood swings. Regular physical movement, especially zone 2 cardio or resistance training, promotes neurochemical balance and lowers stress hormones. These physical habits create a more stable baseline, which makes it easier to practice emotional discipline when life applies pressure. They are not optional, they are foundational. Training yourself to sit in discomfort without needing to fix, escape, or numb it builds the kind of emotional strength that sustains discipline through any challenge. Discomfort is the crucible where emotional regulation is forged. If you avoid discomfort, you avoid growth. But if you can sit with it, breathe through it, let it rise and pass without reaction, you develop inner power that can't be shaken by circumstance. The brain learns that discomfort is survivable, that you can feel intense emotion and still act in alignment with your values. This is how emotional discipline becomes identity, not just a technique.